father arrived unannounced at his daughter's school, a secret mission to whisk her away for a surprise lunch. He envisioned her face lighting up, a shared meal filled with laughter and connection. Little did he know, the scene that awaited him in the school cafeteria would forever be etched in his memory, a haunting tableau of pain and neglect. Hello everyone and welcome to our story. Before we dive in, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? Perhaps sunny Florida, across the pond in the United Kingdom, maybe as far as South Africa, or the vibrant island of Jamaica. We're eager to hear from you. Richard Cole resided in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. The house was meticulously maintained, almost sterile in its perfection. Its sheer size amplified the emptiness, giving it the feel of a museum rather than a home filled with warmth and life. Each morning, Richard would leave for work before the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon. Every evening, he would return only after darkness had fallen and the streetlights cast an eerie glow. Dinner was typically a pre-prepared meal left in the refrigerator by Mrs. Florence, the Cole family's housekeeper of 12 years. A kind, gentle soul with graying hair and perpetually warm, caring eyes, Mrs. Florence had become a fixture in the household. At the vast, formal dining table, a small chair always awaited Sarah, Richard's 9-year-old daughter. Her plate and silverware were meticulously arranged, a picture of perfect order. Yet, on most nights, Sarah barely touched her food, her appetite seemingly diminished by something deeper than mere pickiness. Sarah was an exceptionally quiet child, preferring the solace of her own company. She would spend hours sitting by the expansive window in her room, lost in a world of her own creation, brought to life with colored pencils. Her drawings often featured the flowers and birds she observed around the lake behind their imposing home. Mrs. Florence cherished Sarah as if she were her own granddaughter, often bringing her freshly baked cookies and gently encouraging her to join her in the garden. But Sarah would usually respond with a soft shake of her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to wait until Daddy comes home." Richard loved his daughter dearly, though his expression of that love was often misguided. He believed that providing her with the best education, designer clothes, and a secure home was sufficient. He equated hard work and financial success with paternal affection, a way of taking care of responsibilities, as he often phrased it. One day, Richard attended a parent-teacher conference at Sarah's school. It was there that he first met Vivian Harper, Sarah's teacher. Young, strikingly beautiful, and undeniably intelligent, Vivian possessed a warm smile and a soothing voice. "Sarah is a truly wonderful student, Mr. Cole," Vivian had said, her eyes sparkling with genuine enthusiasm. "She's incredibly creative and remarkably kind, but she can also be quite shy. She could benefit from a little more of your attention, Mr. Cole." Richard felt a pang of discomfort, a sudden awareness of his absence in his daughter's life. He realized, with a jolt, that he knew very little about Sarah's daily existence at school. What did she eat for lunch? Who were her friends? What truly made her happy? A few days later, Vivian sent Richard a handwritten letter, expressing her gratitude for his attendance at the meeting. She included a drawing Sarah had made, a vibrant rainbow bursting with color. Following that, Vivian began sending weekly emails with updates on Sarah's progress. Sometimes she would attach photos of Sarah diligently working on art projects or engrossed in a book. Her messages brought Richard a sense of relief, a comforting reassurance that someone was looking out for his daughter during the long hours he couldn't be there. Vivian's first visit to the house occurred on a day when Sarah was feeling unwell. She arrived with homemade chicken soup and crackers, explaining, "Sarah doesn't eat much at school. I'm a little concerned about her." Richard was deeply appreciative of her thoughtfulness. Mrs. Florence stood silently in the kitchen doorway, observing the scene with a troubled expression on her face, though she refrained from speaking. After that, Vivian's visits became more frequent. She attended Sarah's birthday party, admired Sarah's artwork, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to comfort and encourage her. One evening, Vivian sat beside Sarah, who was sketching in her notebook. "This child needs a mother," Vivian remarked softly, her voice laced with genuine concern. "Every little girl does." Richard heard those words and remained silent for a long moment, contemplating their weight. He knew she was right. The house, despite its opulence, felt cold and devoid of the nurturing warmth a mother could provide. Soon, Richard and Vivian began meeting for coffee, engaging in conversations that stretched beyond school-related matters. Sometimes they would chat at the school itself, other times they would sit together in the garden while Sarah drew nearby, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Vivian made Richard feel as though happiness might be attainable again, that his daughter could finally experience the joys of a complete and loving family. Mrs. Florence observed these changes with a watchful eye. She studied Vivian carefully, a subtle unease growing within her. One day, she noticed Vivian holding Sarah's hand near the front door. Vivian was smiling, but something about her eyes seemed cold and calculating. "Mr. Cole," Mrs. Florence said quietly that evening, her voice tinged with apprehension. "I'm not entirely sure about Miss Vivian. Something just doesn't feel right." Richard frowned, dismissing her concerns. "You're worrying too much, Mrs. Florence. Vivian is a good person. She genuinely cares about Sarah." Mrs. Florence didn't argue, but simply poured his tea and quietly walked away, her doubts lingering in the air. 6 months later, a newspaper headline blared, "Millionaire Richard Cole finds happiness again." The article detailed his upcoming marriage to Vivian Harper. The wedding was small and private, attended only by close family members and a few select business associates. Vivian wore a stunning white dress, while Sarah stood beside her in a matching dress, clutching a small bouquet of flowers. But Sarah's face was pale and expressionless, a stark contrast to the joyous occasion. When reporters asked Richard how he felt, he beamed and declared, "I'm incredibly lucky to have found someone who truly understands me and loves my daughter." That night, after all the guests had departed, the lights in the mansion remained on late. Mrs. Florence diligently cleaned up the remnants of the celebration, the gentle clinking of plates echoing through the otherwise silent house. Upstairs, Sarah stood by her bedroom window, clutching an old drawing she had made long ago. It was a picture of her mother, her real mother, Emma, smiling warmly and holding Sarah's hand. Sarah gazed at the drawing for a long time, her heart aching with a longing she couldn't express. Then, with deliberate care, she folded it neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, replacing it with a wedding photo of her father and Vivian, both radiating happiness. Sarah's eyes were filled with sadness and a profound sense of emptiness, but no one seemed to notice. 3 months later, life in the mansion underwent a rapid transformation following the wedding. Vivian assumed control of every aspect of their lives. She dictated what Sarah would wear, what she would eat, when she would study, and when she would sleep. "I'm a teacher," Vivian would say with a practiced smile whenever Richard questioned her seemingly strict methods. "I know what children need. Trust me." And Richard, blinded by his desire for a perfect family, did trust her implicitly. He remained consumed by his work, attending endless meetings, fielding countless phone calls, and overseeing numerous building projects. He continued to leave early and return late, just as he always had. But Sarah stopped drawing. She stopped sitting by the window, lost in her daydreams. She stopped waiting for her father to come home. Mrs. Florence observed these changes with growing alarm. She noticed how Sarah flinched whenever Vivian called her name, how her hands trembled during dinner. She saw the palpable fear in the child's eyes, a silent plea for help that went unnoticed by everyone except her. One morning, Mrs. Florence found Sarah sobbing quietly in the laundry room, hidden amongst the piles of clean linens. "What's wrong, sweet girl?" Mrs. Florence asked, kneeling down beside her, her voice laced with concern. Sarah shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "Nothing. I'm fine." "You can tell me, darling," Mrs. Florence said gently, offering a comforting hand. But Sarah simply whispered, her voice barely audible, "Please don't tell Vivian I was crying. Please." Mrs. Florence's heart broke into a million pieces. That evening, she attempted to speak with Richard once again, hoping to penetrate his blissful ignorance. "Mr. Cole, something is terribly wrong with Sarah. She's not herself. She's frightened." Richard looked weary and preoccupied. "Mrs. Florence, Sarah is simply adjusting. Vivian says it takes time for children to adapt to a new parent. We need to be patient." "But sir." "Enough, Mrs. Florence," Richard said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I appreciate your concern, but Vivian is a professional. She knows what she's doing." Mrs. Florence remained silent, but she didn't cease her watchful vigilance. Sarah's life at school deteriorated further. Vivian, as her teacher, held an inescapable power over her. At home, Vivian controlled everything. At school, her control intensified. In class, Vivian would repeatedly call on Sarah, relentlessly peppering her with questions she couldn't answer. When Sarah inevitably stumbled, Vivian would sigh dramatically and say, "Really, Sarah? You should know this by now," eliciting snickers from the other children. At lunchtime, Sarah was forced to sit alone at a small, isolated table in the corner of the cafeteria, separated from the other students who sat together, laughing and sharing stories. Vivian justified this isolation by claiming that Sarah was too slow and needed to focus on eating properly. Sarah's lunch was always noticeably different from everyone else's. While the other children enjoyed warm, nutritious meals, pasta with flavorful sauce, crispy chicken, and fresh fruit, Sarah was given cold leftovers, often appearing old and unappetizing, as though they had been sitting out for hours. Her milk carton was invariably dented and lukewarm. It looked and smelled like discarded scraps. When Sarah couldn't finish her food, Vivian would force her to remain at the table until every last bite was gone, even if it meant missing recess. "You're so ungrateful," Vivian would whisper coldly when no other teachers were within earshot. "Your father works so hard to give you everything, and you can't even finish your lunch." Sarah stopped talking at school. She stopped raising her hand in class. She stopped smiling altogether. At night, she would bury her face in her pillow and sob silently, desperately trying to muffle her cries so that no one would hear. Richard remained oblivious to all of this. He attributed Sarah's quiet demeanor to her missing her mother. He assumed her lack of appetite was simply due to her being a picky eater. He desperately wanted to believe that everything was fine because Vivian assured him that it was. But deep down, in a place he consciously avoided acknowledging, Richard sensed that something was terribly wrong. He just didn't yet comprehend the full extent of the damage. It was a Tuesday morning in late November. Richard sat in his office, ostensibly reviewing plans for a new building, but his mind kept wandering back to Sarah. He hadn't seen her genuinely smile in months. She barely even looked at him anymore. Whenever he inquired about school, she would simply reply, "It's fine, Daddy." But nothing felt fine. Richard made a snap decision. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," he instructed his secretary. "I'm going to visit my daughter's school." His secretary appeared surprised by his sudden change of plans. "Is everything okay, Mr. Cole?" "I don't know," Richard replied quietly, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. "But I intend to find out." He drove across the city in his sleek black car, observing the passing buildings and trees with a newfound sense of urgency. His heart felt heavy with foreboding. When he arrived at Riverside Academy, the security guard greeted him warmly. "Good to see you, Mr. Cole. Are you here for the donation meeting?" "Not yet," Richard responded. "First, I'd like to see Sarah. Could you direct me to the lunchroom?" "Certainly, sir. Right this way." The guard led him through the quiet hallways. Richard could hear the distant sounds of children's voices, laughing, chattering, and playing. It sounded happy and carefree, yet something deep within him urged him to keep walking, to confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long. They reached the doors of the lunchroom. Richard stepped inside, and the scene that unfolded before him sent a chill through his veins. The lunchroom was large and brightly lit, filled with rows of long tables where children sat eating and conversing. The air was filled with the enticing aroma of warm food, tomato soup, freshly baked bread, and roasted chicken. Trays clattered. Children laughed. Teachers strolled between the tables, smiling and offering encouragement. On the surface, everything appeared normal. It looked happy and inviting. Richard scanned the room, frantically searching for Sarah. First, he didn't see her. Then, his gaze landed on the far corner of the room, a small area set apart from the rest. There, at a tiny table meant for a single person, sat his daughter, Sarah, utterly alone. While all the other children sat together at large tables, sharing food and jokes, Sarah was isolated and solitary. Her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped forward as if she were trying to make herself invisible, to disappear from the face of the earth. Richard's heart clenched with a mixture of pain and anger. He took a step closer, his eyes riveted to her. In front of Sarah was a lunch tray, but something about it seemed terribly wrong. The other children's trays were laden with warm, appetizing meals: pasta, smothered in rich tomato sauce, crispy chicken strips, colorful fruit cups, and chilled chocolate milk. Their trays looked fresh and vibrant. Sarah's tray, in stark contrast, held only cold, unappetizing leftovers. The bread was hard and crusty. The vegetables were wilted and brown, as though they had been sitting out for hours. Her milk carton was dented and warm. It looked like garbage. Richard's stomach twisted with a surge of nausea. He watched as Sarah tentatively picked up her fork, her hand trembling slightly. She attempted to take a bite of the cold food, but then stopped abruptly. She put the fork down, her thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Richard started walking toward her, his pace quickening with each step. And then he heard a voice, a loud, sharp voice that sliced through the cheerful noise of the lunchroom like a jagged knife. "Sarah Cole, why aren't you eating?" Richard froze, his blood running cold. He turned toward the source of the voice. There, standing near the center of the lunchroom with her arms crossed and her expression hardened, was Vivian, his wife, Sarah's stepmother, Sarah's teacher. Vivian's eyes were fixed on Sarah, devoid of any warmth or compassion. Her mouth was pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "I asked you a question, Sarah," Vivian repeated, her voice echoing across the room. "Why aren't you eating?" Some of the other children stopped talking, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. They turned to look at Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sarah's head dropped even lower, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I'm not very hungry, Miss Vivian," Sarah whispered, her voice so soft that Richard could barely hear it. "Not hungry?" Vivian's voice grew louder, laced with sarcasm. "You're never hungry, are you? Always wasting food. Always making excuses." Sarah didn't respond, her silence amplifying her vulnerability. She looked as though she wished she could simply vanish into the floor. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Vivian snapped, her tone unforgiving. Slowly, painfully, Sarah lifted her head. Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Richard's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. His heart was pounding in his chest, so loud he could hear it in his ears. Vivian walked toward Sarah's table, her high heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. Click, click, click. The sound resonated in the silence, like a clock counting down to an inevitable explosion. She stopped directly in front of Sarah's small table and looked down at her with an expression of undisguised contempt. "You will sit here until you finish every single bite," Vivian declared coldly. "Do you understand me? I don't care if it takes all afternoon. You will not leave this table until that tray is empty." But it's cold," Sarah whispered, a tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "Then you should have eaten faster," Vivian hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "Other children are grateful for their food. Other children don't complain. But you're always difficult, always dramatic, always causing problems." Sarah's whole body was shaking now. More tears streamed down her face, a testament to her profound distress. "Stop crying," Vivian commanded sharply. "You're embarrassing yourself." But Sarah couldn't stop. She was desperately trying to suppress her sobs, but the tears kept flowing, an unstoppable torrent of anguish. And that's when Richard truly saw it. He saw the abject terror in his daughter's eyes, the way she was curled up in her chair, trying to shrink herself smaller. He saw the uncontrollable trembling of her hands and the way she looked at Vivian as though she were staring at a monster, a terrifying figure of authority. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't teaching. This was pure, unadulterated cruelty. This was abuse, plain and simple. And he, in his blind naivete, had allowed it to happen. Something exploded within Richard. A rage so intense and all-consuming that it obliterated everything else. But beneath the surface of that blinding rage lay something even more devastating. Guilt and shame. He had let this happen. He had entrusted this woman with the care of his precious daughter, and she had systematically, relentlessly hurt her. Every single day, she had inflicted pain and suffering, and he had been too blind to see it. Richard didn't think, he simply reacted. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate as he strode across the lunchroom floor, the sound attracting the attention of several children. A few teachers turned their heads, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. Vivian was still standing over Sarah, glaring down at her with unwavering hostility, when Richard's voice cut through the air like a thunderclap. "Get away from my daughter." Vivian's head snapped up, her eyes widening in surprise as she registered Richard's presence. For a fleeting moment, a brief and telling flicker of fear crossed her face. Then, she quickly composed herself, straightening her posture and summoning that familiar warm, gentle smile she always used to manipulate others. "Richard," she said brightly, as if nothing untoward was happening. "What a wonderful surprise. I had no idea you were visiting today." Richard didn't return her smile. His eyes were cold and hard, like chips of flint. "Step away from her," he repeated quietly, his voice dangerously low. By now, the entire lunchroom had fallen silent. Every child, every teacher, every lunch worker, everyone was watching, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Vivian's smile faltered, revealing the fear and anger simmering beneath. "Richard, you don't understand. I said, step away," Richard repeated, his voice unwavering. Vivian took a step back, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of false innocence. "You're misunderstanding the situation. I was simply reminding Sarah to finish her lunch. She has a habit of wasting food, and I don't want her to." "Don't," Richard interrupted, his voice low and menacing. "Don't say another word." He brushed past Vivian without so much as a glance and knelt down beside Sarah's chair. His daughter was still crying, her face buried in her hands, her entire body racked with sobs. "Sarah?" Richard said softly, his voice completely different now, gentle and filled with heartbreaking tenderness. "Sweetheart, it's Daddy. Look at me." Sarah peeked through her fingers, her eyes red and swollen. When she saw her father, a sob escaped her throat. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and a desperate longing. "I'm here," Richard reassured her, his own eyes filling with tears. "I'm right here, baby." He looked down at the tray of cold, disgusting food. He looked at his daughter's thin arms and pale face. He looked at the tears streaming down her cheeks, and in that moment he understood everything. "You don't have to eat this," Richard said firmly. "You never have to eat this again." But Miss Vivian said. "I don't care what she said," Richard retorted, his voice fierce now. "She's wrong. She's been wrong about everything." He stood up and gently lifted Sarah into his arms. She was so light, so small. She wrapped her thin arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, crying harder now, finally finding solace in his embrace. Richard turned to face Vivian. She was standing a few feet away, her face contorted with anger, but she was still desperately trying to maintain her facade of composure. "Richard, you're making a scene," she said, her voice strained and brittle. "Sarah needs to learn discipline. She needs to be safe," Richard interrupted, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "And she's not safe with you." Vivian's eyes flashed with fury. "I'm her teacher. I'm her mother. I know what's best for her." "You are not her mother," Richard emphasized, each word like a hammer blow. "And you never will be." He surveyed the lunchroom, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the other teachers, who were watching with shocked expressions. He saw the children staring with wide eyes, their innocent world suddenly shattered. He saw the lunch workers standing frozen in place, their faces etched with disbelief. "Does anyone else see what's happening here?" Richard asked loudly, his voice ringing with indignation. "Does anyone else see how my daughter is being treated?" Silence. Then, slowly, a young teacher near the back raised her hand. She looked nervous and hesitant, but determined to speak the truth. I've noticed," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Sarah always sits alone. She always gets different food. And Miss Vivian she's very strict with Sarah. More strict than with the other children." Another teacher spoke up, gaining courage from the first. "I've seen it too. I thought about saying something, but you didn't," Richard finished, his voice heavy with disappointment. "None of you did." He turned his attention back to Vivian. Her mask was finally slipping, revealing the darkness that lurked beneath. Her face was flushed with anger. "You don't understand," Vivian said tightly, her voice barely controlled. "Sarah is a difficult child. She needs special handling. She's manipulative. She's 9 years old," Richard interrupted, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's a scared, hurting little girl, and you've been torturing her." "I have done no such thing," Vivian snapped, her carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. "I have tried to help her. I have tried to teach her discipline and respect, but she's stubborn and ungrateful. Just like..." She stopped abruptly, realizing she had almost revealed too much. Just like what? Richard pressed, his voice cold and demanding. Finish that sentence. Vivian pressed her lips together and remained silent, refusing to elaborate. Richard held Sarah closer, his arms shielding her from the world. She was still crying into his shoulder, her small body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. We're leaving, Richard announced, his voice resolute. And I'm calling my lawyer. Whatever you thought this was, whatever sick game you've been playing, it's over. He started walking toward the door, his steps purposeful and unwavering. Richard, wait, Vivian called out, her voice now tinged with desperation. You're overreacting. If you would just listen to me. But Richard didn't stop. He didn't look back. He carried his daughter out of the lunchroom, through the hallways, past the offices, and out into the bright afternoon sunlight. Sarah clung to him as though she were afraid he might disappear, leaving her vulnerable once more. It's okay, Richard whispered, his own tears streaming down his face. It's okay, sweetheart. I've got you, and I'm never letting anyone hurt you again. He meant it with every fiber of his being. He would spend the rest of his life making sure of it. Richard's driver was waiting by the car. When he saw Richard carrying Sarah, his eyes widened with concern. Mr. Cole, is everything all right? Take us home, Richard instructed, his voice firm. Now. The driver opened the door quickly, and Richard climbed into the back seat with Sarah still nestled securely in his arms. She hadn't released her grip on him, holding on to his shirt, as though it were the only safe haven in the world. As the car pulled away from the school, Richard looked down at his daughter. Her crying had subsided into soft, hiccuping sobs, but her eyes were red and swollen, and her face was so pale and thin. How had he not noticed? How had he been so utterly blind to her suffering? Sarah, he said gently, his voice filled with remorse. I need you to tell me the truth. Has Miss Vivian been treating you like that every day? Sarah didn't respond at first. She just stared down at her hands, her silence speaking volumes. You won't get in trouble, Richard promised, his voice laced with sincerity. I just need to know what's been happening. Finally, in a voice so small that Richard had to lean closer to hear, Sarah whispered. Yes. Richard's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just below the surface. Every day? Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes filled with fear. What else has she done? Richard asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer, fearing the extent of the abuse. Has she hurt you in other ways? Sarah remained silent for a long moment, her mind racing with painful memories. Then, slowly and haltingly, she began to speak. At home, she makes me sit in my room for hours, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She says I'm not allowed to come out until I've written. I will be a better daughter 100 times. Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him, the cruelty of Vivian's actions sickeningly clear. She takes away my drawing pencils, Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. She says drawing is a waste of time. She says I need to focus on being better. Better at what? Richard asked, his heart breaking with every word. Just better. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, her pain palpable. She says I'm never good enough. She says I make her look bad. She says if I really loved you, I would try harder to be perfect. Richard pulled Sarah closer, his own eyes burning with a mixture of anger and grief. Oh, baby, you are perfect, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. You've always been perfect. But she says I'm wrong, Richard said firmly. Everything she's told you is a lie. Sarah looked up at him with those big, sad eyes, searching for reassurance. Are you going to send me back to school? No, Richard answered immediately, his voice unwavering. Never. Not to that school. Not with her. But she's your wife. She lives in our house. Richard's expression hardened, his resolve strengthening with each passing moment. Not for long. When they arrived home, Mrs. Florence was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked up when she heard the front door open, and her face paled when she saw Richard carrying Sarah, her distress immediately apparent. Mr. Cole, what happened? Mrs. Florence, Richard said, his voice tight with controlled anger. How long have you known? Mrs. Florence's eyes widened with alarm. She looked at Sarah, then back at Richard, her expression filled with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. Known what, sir? Don't, Richard warned, his voice rising slightly. Don't protect her. Not anymore. How long have you known what Vivian has been doing to Sarah? Mrs. Florence's shoulders sagged, her posture defeated. She looked down at her hands, shame etched across her face. I suspected from the beginning, she admitted quietly, her voice barely a whisper. But I had no proof, and when I tried to tell you, you didn't listen. Richard felt the full weight of his failure crushing down on him, the realization of his negligence a heavy burden to bear. I should have listened. Yes, Mrs. Florence said, meeting his eyes with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. You should have. The words stung, but Richard knew he deserved them. Where is Vivian now? He asked, his voice laced with barely suppressed fury. She's not home yet. She usually arrives around 4 o'clock. Richard glanced at the clock. It was 1:30. You had time, he said softly, directing the words at Sarah. Sarah, he said gently, his voice filled with tenderness. Mrs. Florence is going to take you upstairs. She's going to make you something warm to eat, whatever you want, and then she's going to stay with you. Okay. Sarah's grip tightened on his shirt, her fear still palpable. "Don't leave me," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. "I'm not leaving," Richard promised, his voice unwavering. "I'm just going to make some phone calls, very important phone calls, and then I'll come check on you. Promise." Sarah looked uncertain, but Mrs. Florence stepped forward, her eyes filled with gentle compassion. "Come, sweet girl," she said softly, extending a comforting hand. "I'll make you hot chocolate and cinnamon toast, and we can sit together by the window. Would you like that?" Sarah hesitated, then slowly nodded. Richard carefully set her down, and Mrs. Florence took her hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. As they moved towards the staircase, Richard overheard Mrs. Florence whisper, "You're safe now, child. I won't let anything bad happen to you, not on my watch." Richard watched them ascend, his heart aching, before pulling out his phone. He had 3 crucial calls to make. The first was to his lawyer, Marcus Webb. "Marcus, I need you to prepare divorce papers immediately," Richard said, his voice devoid of any preamble. "Emergency filing. I want her out of my house tonight." "Richard, what on earth is going on?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with concern. "My wife has been abusing my daughter," Richard stated, his voice hardening with each word. "Emotionally and psychologically, for months. I have witnesses, Marcus. I have evidence, and I want her gone. Now." A beat of silence hung in the air. "Are you sure about this, Richard? These are serious accusations." "I'm absolutely sure." Richard's voice was like steel. "I saw it with my own eyes today. She's been starving my daughter, humiliating her, isolating her. And I was too busy, too stupid to see it. All of it." "All right," Marcus said, his tone shifting into business mode. "I'll file for an emergency divorce and a restraining order. I'll also contact Child Protective Services. They'll want to investigate thoroughly." "Do whatever you need to do," Richard replied, his voice urgent. "I want a paper trail. I want records. I want to make damn sure she never gets near another child again." "Understood. I'll have the papers ready by this evening." The second call was to the principal of Riverside Academy. "Mr. Cole," Principal Harrison greeted warmly. "I heard you visited today. I apologize that I wasn't available to meet with you regarding the library donation." "I'm not calling about the donation," Richard interrupted, his voice clipped. "I'm calling to inform you that my daughter will not be returning to your school." I'm sorry to hear that. May I ask why?" "Because one of your teachers, my wife, has been abusing her," Richard said bluntly, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "In front of other teachers, in front of other students, and no one did a damn thing about it." Silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Mr. Cole, I wasn't aware of any." "Then you should have been." Richard cut him off, his voice cold. "I will be filing a formal complaint. I will be contacting the school board, and if I find out that anyone on your staff knew what was happening and stayed silent, I will take legal action. I promise you that." "Mr. Cole, please, let's discuss this rationally," the principal pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. "There's nothing to discuss. My daughter was being tortured under your roof, and your staff did nothing. That's all I need to know." He hung up before the principal could utter another word. The third call was the hardest. He dialed Dr. Patricia Morrison, a child psychologist who had helped Sarah briefly after her mother passed. Sarah had stopped going to sessions when Vivian came into their lives. Vivian had dismissed therapy as unnecessary, claiming she could help Sarah better than any doctor. Another mistake he bitterly acknowledged. Another time Richard had ignored his own gut feeling. "Dr. Morrison," Richard said when she answered, his voice strained. "This is Richard Cole. I need your help. It's urgent." By 3 p.m., Richard had made all his calls. Marcus was diligently preparing the divorce papers. The principal was likely in full-blown panic mode. Dr. Morrison had graciously agreed to come to the house that evening to see Sarah. Richard went upstairs, his steps heavy with dread and determination, to check on his daughter. He found Sarah and Mrs. Florence sitting together in Sarah's room. Sarah was dressed in warm, cozy pajamas and holding a mug of steaming hot chocolate. She had even managed to eat half a piece of cinnamon toast, a feat Richard hadn't witnessed in weeks. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Richard asked, his voice gentle as he sat down on the edge of the bed. Sarah looked at him with uncertain, hesitant eyes. "Is Miss Vivian going to be angry at me?" "Miss Vivian is not going to hurt you ever again," Richard said firmly, his voice radiating conviction. "I promise you that, Sarah. But she's going to come home," Sarah said, her voice small and filled with fear. "She always comes home." "Yes, she'll come home," Richard said, carefully choosing his words. "But I'm going to talk to her, and then she's going to leave. She won't live here anymore." Sarah's eyes widened, hope flickering within them. "Really? Really? But you married her. You said she was going to be my new mommy." Richard's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I made a terrible, terrible mistake, baby. I thought she would take care of you. I thought she would love you, but I was wrong. And I'm so sorry." Sarah stared at him, and for the first time in months, something shifted in her eyes. A tiny, fragile spark of hope ignited. "You're not mad at me?" she whispered. "Mad at you?" Richard looked utterly horrified. "Sarah, no. None of this is your fault. Not one single bit. You didn't do anything wrong." "But Miss Vivian said." "Miss Vivian lied," Richard said, taking Sarah's small hands in his. She lied about everything, sweetheart. You are a wonderful, kind, beautiful little girl. You are smart and creative and brave. And I'm so sorry I didn't protect you from her. Sarah's lip trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. Then suddenly, she threw her arms around Richard's neck and burst into tears. Real, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her very being. Richard held her tightly, rocking her gently as she cried, letting her release all the pent-up fear and pain. Mrs. Florence quietly wiped her own eyes with her apron, her heart breaking for the little girl. I was so scared, Daddy, Sarah sobbed, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I was so scared all the time. I know, baby, I know, but you don't have to be scared anymore. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. They sat like that for a long time, until Sarah's sobs quieted into hiccups and then into steady, even breathing. She was finally falling asleep in his arms, utterly exhausted from months of constant fear and pain. Richard gently laid her down on the bed and pulled the blanket up over her. He brushed her hair back from her face, his touch feather-light. I'll be right downstairs, he whispered. You're safe now, baby. Mrs. Florence followed him out into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind them. What are you going to do when she gets here? Mrs. Florence asked quietly, her brow furrowed with concern. Richard's expression hardened, his eyes turning cold and resolute. I'm going to tell her exactly what I think of her, and then I'm going to make damn sure she pays for what she's done. Be careful, Mr. Cole, Mrs. Florence cautioned. That woman is dangerous. I know, Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. But so am I, especially when someone hurts my daughter. I will do anything to protect her. At 4:15 p.m., Richard heard the front door open. He was sitting in the living room, waiting, the tension coiling in his gut. His lawyer had already delivered the divorce papers. They sat on the coffee table in front of him, a stark declaration of the impending war. Richard, Vivian's voice called out from the entryway, laced with irritation. Richard, are you home? We need to talk about what happened today. You completely embarrassed me in front of my colleagues at school. Richard didn't answer. He heard the sharp click of her heels against the marble floor as she came into the living room. When she saw him sitting there, his face unreadable, her expression shifted, a flicker of unease in her eyes. She could sense that something was profoundly different. What's going on? She asked, her voice cautious now. Richard picked up the envelope from the coffee table and held it out to her, his gaze unwavering. What's this? Vivian asked, taking the envelope with a hesitant hand. Open it and see for yourself. Vivian took the envelope and pulled out the papers. As she read, her face went from confusion to shock to rage, the emotions warring within her. Divorce papers? She said, her voice rising in disbelief. Are you serious right now? Is this some kind of joke? Completely serious, Vivian. It's no joke. Because of what happened at school? Vivian laughed, but it sounded forced, hollow. Richard, you're being ridiculous. Sarah's fine. She's just... Don't, Richard said, his voice deadly calm, a warning in his tone. Don't say her name, Vivian, and don't pretend for 1 second that you care about her. We both know the truth now, don't we? Vivian's eyes narrowed, her mask of composure beginning to crumble. What exactly do you think you know, Richard? Everything, Richard said, his voice resonating with fury. I know you've been abusing her. I know you've been starving her, humiliating her, hurting her, scarring her. I know you've made her life a living hell while I was too blind, too damn trusting to see it. That's absurd. Vivian snapped, her voice laced with venom. I have been trying to help that child. She's difficult and manipulative. Richard's voice rose for the first time, echoing through the room, fueled by righteous anger. She's a traumatized little girl who lost her mother. And instead of helping her, you tortured her. You're a monster. Vivian's carefully constructed mask finally shattered completely. Her face twisted with anger, revealing the ugly truth beneath. You want to know the truth? She said coldly, her eyes glinting with malice. Fine. Yes, I was hard on her. She needed it. Because she needed it? She was spoiled and weak and pathetic, just like her mother probably was. Richard stood up, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his body trembling with barely suppressed rage. Watch your mouth, Vivian. Or what? Vivian challenged, her eyes burning with defiance. You'll divorce me? Too late for that. You already are. You'll ruin my reputation? Go ahead. I'll tell everyone that you're an absent father who ignored his daughter until it was convenient to play the hero. Who's going to believe you? Get out of my house, Richard said quietly, his voice laced with icy contempt. This is my house too. Vivian shot back, her voice shrill. I'm your wife, remember? Not anymore. You have 30 minutes to pack a bag and leave. My lawyer will contact you about the rest of your belongings. Consider yourself gone, Vivian. You can't do this to me, Richard. I already have. Richard stepped closer, his eyes blazing with fury. And if you ever come near my daughter again, if you ever even speak her name, I will make damn sure you never teach again. I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are, Vivian. I promise you that. Vivian stared at him, her face red with fury, her chest heaving with anger. For a moment, Richard thought she might lash out physically. But then she laughed, a cold, bitter, and unsettling sound. You think you've won, don't you? She said, her voice dripping with venom. But you haven't, Richard. That girl is broken. I didn't break her. Her mother's death did. And nothing you do will fix her. She will always be damaged. A shadow of what she could have been. Get out, Richard repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Vivian grabbed her purse and headed for the stairs, her heels clicking angrily on the marble. I'll get my things. But this isn't over, Richard. You haven't heard the last of me. Yes, it is, Richard said to her, retreating back. It is over. 20 minutes later, Vivian came back downstairs with 2 suitcases. Her face was cold and hard, like a mask of stone. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't apologize. She just walked out the front door and slammed it behind her, the sound echoing through the silent house. Richard stood in the living room for a long moment, listening to the sound of her car driving away, the silence that followed a deafening roar in his ears. Then his legs gave out. He sank down onto the couch, put his face in his hands, and finally let himself feel everything. The guilt crashed over him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in its depths. He had failed his daughter. He had brought a monster into their home and called her mother. He had ignored the warnings, dismissed the signs, and trusted the wrong person, blinded by his own grief and loneliness. Sarah had been suffering for months, and he hadn't seen it. What kind of father does that? Mrs. Florence found him there, 10 minutes later, still sitting with his head in his hands, his body racked with sobs. She didn't say anything. She just sat down beside him and patted his shoulder gently, offering silent comfort. You did the right thing today, Mr. Cole, she said quietly, her voice filled with compassion. I should have done it months ago, Richard said, his voice muffled by his hands. You tried to tell me, Mrs. Florence. You tried to warn me and I didn't listen. Yes, I did, Mrs. Florence said honestly. But you're listening now, Mr. Cole. That's what matters most. You're finally seeing the truth. Richard lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes red and swollen. How do I fix this? How do I help her heal from what I let happen? How do I erase the damage Vivian has done? You start by being there, Mr. Cole, Mrs. Florence said, her voice gentle but firm. Every day, every moment she needs you. You don't fix it quickly. You fix it slowly, with patience and love and unwavering support. It will be a long road, but you can do it. Richard nodded, wiping his eyes, his resolve hardening. I'm going to take time off work. As much time as she needs. My job can wait. Good, Mr. Cole, Mrs. Florence said, her eyes twinkling with approval. That's a start. A very good start. That evening, Dr. Patricia Morrison arrived at the house. She was a kind, compassionate woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back into a neat bun and gentle, knowing eyes. She had helped Sarah after Emma died, and Sarah remembered her with a flicker of recognition. When Dr. Morrison came upstairs to Sarah's room, Sarah was sitting by the window with a soft, plush blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, as if seeking warmth and security. She looked so small and fragile, like a delicate flower that had been through a harsh winter. Hello, Sarah, Dr. Morrison said softly, sitting down in a chair nearby, her voice calm and reassuring. Do you remember me? Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky outside the window. Your father told me you've been having a hard time lately, Sarah, Dr. Morrison said gently. He's very worried about you. He asked me to come talk to you if that's okay with you. Sarah didn't say anything for a moment, her gaze distant and lost. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she asked, Is Miss Vivian really gone? For good? Yes, Sarah, Dr. Morrison said, her voice warm and reassuring. She's really gone. She won't be coming back here, ever again. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and her lower lip trembled. What if she comes back anyway? What if she gets mad at me for telling? I didn't mean to get her in trouble. She can't come back, Dr. Morrison said gently but firmly. Your father has made sure of that, Sarah. There are legal papers now that say she's not allowed to come near you or this house. If she tries to, the police will stop her. You are safe now, Sarah. Really, truly safe. Really? Sarah's voice was so small and hopeful that it broke Dr. Morrison's heart. Really? Dr. Morrison confirmed, her voice filled with conviction. Really, Sarah, you're safe now. I know it's hard to believe after everything that's happened, but it's true. Your father loves you so much, and he's going to protect you. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the darkening sky, the silence broken only by the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. She said it was my fault, Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible. She said if I was a better daughter, she wouldn't have to be so mean to me. She said I made her do it, that I deserved the punishments. Dr. Morrison's heart ached with a familiar pain. She had heard these words from so many children before, children who had been hurt by the very adults they were supposed to trust and love. The lies they were told, the blame they carried, the wounds they hid deep inside. Sarah, look at me, Dr. Morrison said gently, reaching out to take Sarah's hand. Sarah slowly turned her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and vulnerability. Nothing that happened was your fault, Sarah, Dr. Morrison said, speaking slowly and clearly so Sarah would hear every word and understand the truth. Adults are responsible for their own actions. You did not make her hurt you. You could not have stopped her. She chose to be cruel and that choice was hers alone. Do you understand? Sarah's lip trembled, and tears streamed down her face. But I wasn't good enough. I tried to be good, but you were always good enough, Sarah, Dr. Morrison said firmly, her voice filled with unwavering conviction. You are a wonderful child just as you are. You don't have to be perfect, Sarah. You don't have to earn love. You already deserve it just by being you. Sarah burst into tears, the dam finally breaking after months of holding everything inside. Dr. Morrison moved to sit beside her on the window seat and gently put an arm around her shoulders, offering comfort and support. Sarah leaned into her, crying hard, her body shaking with each sob. It's okay to cry, Sarah. Dear, Morrison said softly, her voice soothing and gentle. You've been holding all of this inside for so long. You have been so strong. But now you can let it out. It's okay to cry now, Sarah. You're safe now. They sat together as Sarah cried, deep, painful sobs that seemed to come from the very bottom of her heart, releasing all the pent-up fear and pain. Downstairs, Richard heard his daughter crying, and every sob felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He longed to run upstairs and hold her, to make it all better, but he knew he couldn't. Mrs. Florence put a hand on his arm, stopping him. Let her cry, Mr. Cole, she said, her voice filled with wisdom. She needs this. She needs to let the poison out. She needs to cry. It will help her. Richard nodded. Even though every instinct screamed at him to run upstairs and hold his daughter, he trusted Mrs. Florence's judgment. Sarah needed to cry. She needed to release all the fear and pain she'd been holding inside for so long. He would be there for her when she was ready. He would do whatever it took to help her heal. Later that night, after Dr. Morrison had left with promises to return the next day, Richard sat on the edge of Sarah's bed, watching her sleep. Sarah was tucked under her blankets, looking exhausted, but a little less afraid than before. Daddy, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, sweetheart? What is it? Are you going to go back to work tomorrow? Richard shook his head, his heart aching at the question. No, baby. I'm taking time off work. I'm going to be here with you every day, Sarah, for as long as you need me. Sarah's eyes widened, and a flicker of hope sparked within them. Really? But your company? Won't they be mad at you? My company will be fine without me for a while, Sarah, Richard said, his voice filled with sincerity. You're more important than any building or business deal. You're the most important thing in the world to me, Sarah. And I'm so sorry it took me this long to show you that, sweetheart. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked different, softer, less afraid. I missed you, Daddy, she whispered, her voice filled with longing. Even when you were here, I missed you. I needed you, but you were always busy. Richard felt his own eyes burning, and his heart ached with guilt and regret. I missed you too, baby, and I'm not going to miss any more precious moments with you, Sarah. I promise you that. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, his touch gentle and loving. Try to get some sleep, he said. I'll be right down the hall. If you need me for any reason, you just call for me. Okay, I'll come running. Okay, Sarah said quietly, her eyes closing, her body relaxing. Richard stood up and started to leave, but Sarah's voice stopped him. Daddy? He turned back, his heart filled with anticipation. Yes, sweetheart? Thank you for saving me, Daddy. Richard's heart broke and healed at the same time. Always, Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I will always save you. Always. Promise. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind, torturing himself with the memories. He thought about the day he met Vivian, and how charming and sophisticated she had seemed. He thought about the wedding, and how happy he'd convinced himself they would be. He thought about all the times Mrs. Florence had tried to warn him, subtly pointing out Vivian's coldness and Sarah's increasing sadness. All the time, Sarah had seemed sad or scared, and he had just dismissed it as normal grief, failing to see the signs of abuse and neglect. He had been so blind, so self-absorbed, so foolish. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he heard a sound, a small, frightened cry that pierced through the silence. Richard was out of bed and running before he even fully woke up, his adrenaline pumping. He burst into Sarah's room and found her sitting up in bed, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah, what's wrong? What happened? I had a nightmare, Daddy, Sarah gasped, her voice choked with fear. Miss Vivian was here. She was yelling at me and, it's okay, Sarah. It's okay, Richard said, his voice soothing as he rushed to the bed and pulled her into his arms. It was just a dream, baby. She's not here. She's gone. You're safe. I won't let her hurt you. But what if she comes back? Sarah sobbed, clinging to him tightly. What if she finds a way back in and hurts me again? I'm scared. She won't, Richard said firmly, his voice filled with unwavering conviction. I won't let her, Sarah. No one is going to hurt you ever again. Baby, I promise you that, Sarah. I will protect you with everything I have. Sarah clung to him, shaking with fear, seeking comfort and reassurance. Will you stay with me? She asked, her voice small and pleading. Richard's heart broke at her vulnerability. Of course, sweetheart. I'll stay with you as long as you need me to. Sarah nodded against his chest, her grip tightening. So Richard lay down on top of the blankets beside his daughter and held her hand, offering her his presence and support. He stayed there all night, watching over her as she finally fell back asleep, his gaze never leaving her. He didn't sleep himself. He just watched her breathe, watched the moonlight fall across her peaceful face, and made a silent vow in his heart. I will spend the rest of my life making this right, he thought. I will be the father she deserves. Starting now. Promise. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find her father still beside her, holding her hand, his face etched with love and concern. Daddy, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Did you stay here all night with me? Yes, Sarah, Richard said softly, his voice husky with emotion. I did, sweetheart. And I'll stay every night if you need me to, Sarah. I'll be right here. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, searching for the truth in his eyes. Then, for the first time in months, a genuine smile touched her lips, a fragile but beautiful expression of hope. It was a small smile, a hesitant smile, but it was real, and Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him as he saw the glimmer of light returning to her eyes. Hope bloomed in his chest, a fragile but precious flower pushing through the darkness. Over the next few days, things began to slowly but surely change in the Cole household. Richard canceled all his work meetings and informed his company that he was taking an extended leave of absence, prioritizing his daughter's well-being above all else. He assured his assistant that she could handle the day-to-day operations. Right now, his daughter needed him more than his business ever could. Every morning, Richard made breakfast with Mrs. Florence, turning the simple act of cooking into a joyful ritual. They made pancakes and eggs and fresh fruit, all of Sarah's favorite foods that Vivian had cruelly forbidden, foods that had been replaced with bland, unappetizing meals. At first, Sarah only ate a few bites, her stomach having shrunk from months of improper nourishment. But Richard didn't push her. He just sat with her, talking gently, making her feel safe and loved, creating a nurturing atmosphere. Dr. Morrison came to the house every afternoon, providing much-needed support and guidance. Sometimes she talked to Sarah alone, delving into her deepest fears and anxieties. Sometimes Richard joined them, creating a united front of love and support. Slowly, gently, they began to unpack everything that had happened, helping Sarah process her trauma and find her voice. Sarah talked about the punishments at home, the hours locked in her room, the cruel words that had been like daggers to her heart, the constant criticism that had chipped away at her self-esteem. She talked about school, the isolation, the cold food, the public humiliation that had made her feel so small and worthless. She talked about how scared she'd been all the time, how she'd felt like she was drowning and no one could hear her calling for help, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Richard listened to every word, his heart breaking with each revelation, and each word felt like a punch to his gut, a testament to his failure as a father. But he didn't look away. He didn't interrupt or make excuses. He sat there and listened, and he let Sarah see how truly sorry he was, how deeply he regretted failing to protect her. I should have noticed, Sarah, he said one afternoon, his voice breaking with emotion. I should have seen what was happening. I should have saved you from all of this. You were busy, Daddy, Sarah said quietly, offering him a small measure of forgiveness. She was drawing at the table while they talked, something Dr. Morrison had encouraged her to do again, as a way to express her emotions and find solace in creativity. That's not an excuse, Sarah, Richard said, shaking his head. You needed me, and I wasn't there for you. That's not okay. But I'm here now, Sarah, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise you, I'm never leaving your side again. Sarah looked up from her drawing, her eyes filling with tears, but she smiled through them, her expression a mixture of sadness and gratitude. I love you, Daddy, she whispered, her voice filled with sincerity. I love you, too, sweetheart, Richard said, his own voice thick with emotion. More than anything in this world, Sarah. More than life itself. Meanwhile, the outside world was starting to learn what had happened, the truth seeping out despite Richard's attempts to shield Sarah from further exposure. The school board launched a thorough investigation into Riverside Academy, scrutinizing the administration and staff for their roles in the abuse. Several teachers came forward, their consciences finally prompting them to confess that they had witnessed Vivian's mistreatment of Sarah, but had been too afraid to report it, fearing for their jobs and reputations. The principal was forced to resign in disgrace for failing to protect a vulnerable student, his negligence a damning indictment of the school's culture. Vivian herself was fired from Riverside Academy, her teaching career in ruins, and she lost her teaching license, effectively ending her professional life. The State Board of Education opened their own investigation, further solidifying the case against her. Richard's lawyer filed formal charges against Vivian. Child abuse, emotional cruelty, neglect, seeking justice for the harm she had inflicted on Sarah. The local news picked up the story, sensationalizing the case with headlines like, Teacher accused of abusing stepdaughter at elite private school, sparking public outrage. Richard refused all interview requests, fiercely protective of Sarah and determined to shield her from further scrutiny. He didn't want publicity or notoriety. He just wanted justice for his daughter, and he was willing to fight for it. And slowly, painfully, he got it. Vivian was arrested, her world collapsing around her. She spent a night in jail before posting bail, the experience a stark reminder of the gravity of her situation. She hired an expensive lawyer and tried to fight the charges, vehemently claiming she was innocent, baselessly claiming Sarah was lying, and portraying Richard as just a bitter ex-husband seeking revenge, attempting to manipulate the narrative. But there were too many witnesses and too much damning evidence against her. The security footage from the school cafeteria showed everything. Vivian's cruelty, Sarah's fear, the cold, unappetizing food, the social isolation. Teachers testified about what they'd seen, recounting the humiliating punishments and the constant criticism. Dr. Morrison provided expert testimony about Sarah's trauma, explaining the psychological damage Vivian had inflicted on her. Even Mrs. Florence took the stand, her voice trembling but resolute, and told the court about the dramatic changes she'd witnessed in Sarah after Vivian moved in. The withdrawn behavior, the loss of appetite, the constant fear. In the end, faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of a lengthy prison sentence, Vivian accepted a plea deal, admitting her guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was convicted of child endangerment and emotional abuse, a stain on her record that would follow her for the rest of her life. She received a suspended sentence, meaning she wouldn't go to jail as long as she completed a strict probation period and underwent mandatory counseling, acknowledging the need for professional help. But she was also ordered to stay away from Sarah forever, a permanent restraining order ensuring her safety. If she ever came near Sarah again, she would immediately go to prison, the consequences of her actions finally catching up to her. Richard wanted her to face harsher punishment, feeling that she deserved to suffer for the pain she had caused. But his lawyer explained that emotional abuse cases were often difficult to prosecute, and the fact that Vivian had been convicted at all was a significant victory, a testament to Richard's determination and the bravery of those who had come forward to testify. It's not about revenge, Richard. Dr. Morrison reminded him, her voice gentle but firm. It's about keeping Sarah safe, and that's what this accomplishes. You've ensured that Vivian can never hurt her again. Richard knew she was right, and he understood the importance of protecting Sarah's well-being above all else. But it still felt like Vivian had gotten off too easy, escaping the full consequences of her actions. 3 months passed, and the seasons began to change. Winter slowly turned to spring, and slowly, very slowly, Sarah began to heal, her spirit gradually recovering from the trauma she had endured. It wasn't a linear path. There were good days and bad days, moments of progress and moments of setbacks. There were nights when Sarah woke up screaming from terrifying nightmares, reliving the abuse in her dreams. There were mornings when she couldn't eat because her stomach was in knots, the anxiety overwhelming her. There were moments when she saw someone who looked like Vivian in public and froze in fear, her body reliving the trauma. But there were also moments of light, small victories that filled Richard's heart with hope. The first time Sarah laughed, really laughed, at something funny, both of them froze in surprise, the sound so unexpected and precious. Then Sarah laughed harder, her body shaking with joy, and Richard started laughing too, tears streaming down his face. And Mrs. Florence came running from the kitchen to see what was happening, her face lighting up with happiness. "She's laughing," Mrs. Florence said, her eyes filling with happy tears. "Our girl is laughing again. It's a miracle." The first time Sarah asked for seconds at dinner, after having barely touched her food for months, Richard had to excuse himself from the table for a moment, overcome with emotion and unable to hide his tears. It was a milestone, a sign that she was slowly regaining her appetite and trusting that she would be nourished, not punished. The first time Sarah showed him a drawing she'd made, a picture of the... Richard had that photograph, the one of the two of them holding hands amidst the blooming roses in the garden, framed. He hung it prominently in his office, positioning it so it was the first thing he saw each morning and the last thing he saw each night. A constant reminder, a beacon of hope. Progress was slow, painstakingly so, like watching a glacier inch forward, but it was undeniably real. Dr. Morrison, a woman with a quiet strength and an empathetic gaze, continued her visits 3 times a week. Her sessions weren't just therapy. They were carefully constructed bridges back to Sarah's sense of self. She patiently guided Sarah through the tangled web of anxiety and fear that had ensnared her. She meticulously dismantled the insidious belief that she was somehow responsible for the trauma she had endured, reinforcing, again and again, the irrefutable truth. It wasn't her fault. Dr. Morrison provided Sarah with practical tools, coping mechanisms, and visualization techniques to rebuild her shattered sense of security. She helped Sarah create an internal safe space, a refuge where she could retreat when the memories threatened to overwhelm her. And through it all, Richard was steadfast. He kept the promise he had made in the darkest of hours. He didn't even consider going back to work. His focus was solely, irrevocably on Sarah. He dedicated every waking moment to her healing. Their days were filled with simple, nurturing activities. Reading aloud from well-loved books, taking gentle strolls through the revitalizing garden, him patiently teaching her how to prepare simple, comforting meals, things like grilled cheese and tomato soup, the smells of which filled the house with a sense of home. He would sit beside her for hours as she drew, offering quiet encouragement and admiration for her emerging artistic talent. They talked about everything. Richard shared cherished memories of Emma, Sarah's mother. He recounted funny anecdotes, heartwarming stories, and tales of Emma's infectious laughter, painting a vibrant picture of a woman Sarah barely remembered, but desperately wanted to know. These happy stories brought genuine smiles back to Sarah's face, chasing away some of the shadows that lingered in her eyes. In turn, Sarah, hesitantly at first, began to confide in Richard, sharing her deepest fears, her most fragile dreams, and the anxieties that still plagued her sleep. They were slowly, painstakingly, learning to be close again, relearning the delicate art of trust, rebuilding their fractured bond brick by painstaking brick. I sincerely hope you found watching this journey as compelling as I found creating it. Please take a moment to like, share, and leave a comment below sharing the most impactful lessons you gleaned from Sarah and Richard's story. And I'm always curious. Let me know where in the world you're watching from. Your engagement means the world to me.